Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Professor Mullaney, discussing your new book, How We Disappear. Now, before we start, I'll just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll start right into the questions.
All right, sure. Well, thank you for inviting me. My name is Tom Mullaney. I'm an East Coaster. I'm sort of East Coast born, but I've been out here in California teaching at Stanford this is my 20th year in the history department. I am an historian of modern China and the history of technology and global technology. And How We Disappear is, at last count, I think is my 8th book. But I have 2 kids, and my wife's from Italy. My mother-in-law, my nonna, is visiting right now. And yeah, I play music. I do various things.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. And, your book is very central to what the theme has been for season 9 of this podcast in terms of memory and being able to have that and to be able to express that. So what first drew you to the idea of disappearance in the context of information? And what is a personal experience or an archival encounter or something else? Like, would you be able to explain?
Yeah. So there's 2 timelines to the book, and I think this is true of most books, that the book begins with my father's death. The book sort of ends with the death of my mother, and understandably, people have assumed, or some have, that's what started the process of the book. But the book started maybe 24 years ago, when I don't exactly know why, but I started to take more and more notice of, let's call them, unremarkable ways that things fall apart. So not book burnings and conflagrations and censorship and things, but the sort of leaky, kind of drifty way. And I'll give you one example. It wasn't maybe the origin point, but it really drove home the point. So when I first moved out to Stanford, I was living in San Francisco, and I was buying coffee on a credit card. Like, if I didn't get this job, I don't know what I would have done. But I lived in this house with 7 other people. It was almost like a co-op for young 30-year-olds. And I was 27 at the time, but we're adults. We cleaned up after ourselves. But there was this patio outside, just a very tiny patio. And, there are bicycles there, and there are like various objects and so forth. And one day, sort of the house mom said, well, we're going to clean up. We're going to sort of see who belongs to what and what belongs to who. And, it was fun. We popped some beers. We went out there. We started, we had a table, claim this. Is this your water bottle? Is this your bike? Is this your thing? And long story short, about 30-40% of it was stuff that belonged to no one in the house. But the house, over time, it had been like this co-op for many, many, many years. People came, people went, people came, people went, people came, people went. And I thought it was yours, and Bob thought it was mine, and, Amy thought it was Bob's. And it was just this sort of drift of time. And we had no idea who the stuff belonged to. It was there. It was physically there. But it had become sort of dislodged from the web of meaning, the web of memory, the web of associations. And now it might as well have been just a random object in a thrift store somewhere. And it's little things like that I just became, at some point, kind of obsessed with. And I started taking notes and writing things down. And observations like that was the beginning of it. Like, what happens if we study not dramatic and ultra violent and singular acts of destruction or disappearance, but kind of look at the more almost like erosion process. What happens when we try to inventory all of it and wrap our head around all of it. And that was really the beginning of the book.
Wonderful. And, the book has the subtitle that emphasizes a personal history. How did your own life kind of intersect with the larger story you're telling about information systems?
So this one, I guess, I mean, in some senses, this is even earlier than 24 years ago. But so there's one chapter of the book. It's the beginning, and it's this quote that my dad used to say to me a lot. I was like a very emotional kid. I was, and so whenever I'd get upset, my dad, who was sort of like a baby boomer dad, if you know the type, like sort of, never changed a diaper, wasn't really hands on, sort of thought of parenting as basically mom's work and so forth. And so it was, but his one piece of advice for me as a young child was, don't worry, Tommy, pretty soon you won't remember this, like whatever it was that bothered you today. So, don't sweat it. And as a little kid, I something about that kind of bothered me. Yeah, I distinctly remember. I was like, "Yeah, I know we're talking about something bad right now, Dad, but shouldn't the same logic apply? Like, I'm not going to remember the feeling of the first time I hit a home run in baseball, or like the feeling, the look on the face, the girl that I kissed for the first time. Like, it won't this apply to everything else as well?" And he just stayed. Again, he wasn't necessarily a kind of sit down and talk deep with your son kind of dad, so he just, like, left the room at that point. So I was really it stayed with me, this notion of, you know, what happens to yesterday? Like, where is yesterday? Is it lodged in neurons? Is it embedded in objects? Is it in our muscle memory? Like, we know it's somewhere, or some portion of it. But that I think is where the personal part of it really started from a very young age, I guess.
Yeah, it's just a different way of kind of, I guess, processing that information. And I guess that this goes into what you say. When you say people or things disappear in systems of information, what does that actually look like in practice? I know it's probably similar to what you just indicated, but what does that actually look
Yeah, so one example that when it happened to me, I wasn't very happy about it because it was like a devastating technological failure, but it makes for a great sort of case study. So I'm a musician. The thing I've been doing the longest in my life is writing music. I just, pop songs. I've just been doing it my whole life. And, some people that learn to draw, they have sketchbooks and things. And I have cassette recordings and 4-track recordings. And then I bought this mini disc player in Japan that was just like, it was just constantly with me and is like an essential part of my life. And, and I was a recording musician, a touring musician. So it was also part and parcel to the process of, working on an album and I was doing my job. I was documenting stuff. I was actually naming the files, and this was this practice, this audition, or this. I was doing what you're supposed to do if you want to kind of keep track of this stuff. And this one time, I loaded all of these MP3s onto, I think, an early generation of an iPod. I can't remember which model, and I would carry that around with me, and I'd sort of play it to remember what a song was, and then I labeled everything. And then that one died, or I had to migrate it to like the next generation. And it was a better iPod. It was a better machine, more gadgets, more bells and whistles. And it was a catastrophe because one of the new features of this new device was that it had an auto power saving function. So basically, like you flip through with your little dial to like a particular MP3, and then the title of the file would start kind of ticker taping across the screen. Now, if it's a pop song, like if it's something, if it's a Stax Bolt, if it's Tom Waits or an Otis Redding song, the title is pretty short, so you can read it. But for me, it was, June 26th, this thing, and I give a full name of something, take two or whatever. And that was fine in the previous model. But now with this new power saving function, the screen would go dark before the full title went by. And here's the other part of it. If you like said, oh, I'll just tap it to like turn the machine back on, it would start the process of giving you the name again. And so suddenly this iPod, which had thousands and thousands of files and songs in it, all the files were still there. There was no fire. I didn't drop it in a toilet bowl or something like this. But it had become basically this forensic crash site where if I was going to recover what these were, I would have had to listen to over 1,000 recordings and rewrite all of their names. And that's an example of an information system collapsing by means that we don't often associate with something collapsing. Again, the machine didn't break, no one stole it from me, no, it was it just got lost inside itself. And I was like, I don't have 600 spare hours to rebuild my life. And so I kind of had to move on a little bit. So that was, that's the kind of phenomenon that I tried to get at in different ways in the book.
Absolutely, because that is definitely something that people can relate to and not necessarily align it or classify it or connect it to something as disappearing, so to speak, because as you said, it didn't break per se,
Yeah.
but it just is that you're having to then reclassify all that information. And as well, Professor Mullaney, your work often touches on language and classification. How do
hmm
systems like databases, forms, or and as you mentioned before, naming conventions shape who is visible and then who
mm
is erased?
Yeah. There's a colleague I spoke to, and there's so many brilliant people I had a chance to speak with who, the book is a very short book, so I have there's 10 more books worth of notes, but one story that didn't kind of make its way in because I couldn't quite figure out how to pin it down, but still haunts me, is a dancer who I interviewed who has a sort of training in classical ballet and all the terminology and categorization that comes with that. So all of this different kind of terminology of the shape of the body, the position of the body, the orientation of the body. And then sort of, I guess maybe later in her career, she began to work in a totally different tradition. I think it was Indian dance. So South Asian dance. And there are, long story short, there is a posture or a position in one form of dance that on the face of it, if you were to look at it and just describe like the shape of the body, is identical to the shape of this and posture and position in this other tradition of dance. And so if you were to capture it in notation form, it would look as if they are one and the same thing. But because she's a dancer, she wrote about this, and I'll share this with you afterwards. I'll track down the note. It's noted that in one tradition, when you are in the posture, when you are experiencing the posture, it's as if the energy is like shooting up from the ground. While in the other tradition, I believe this one was the sort of classical ballet, the energetic kind of style of it was almost like you're hanging from a little like there's like a sort of at the top of the skull, there's something that's sort of like you're supposed to be just sort of gently, so the energy is sort of flowing downward. So radically different, utterly different kind of energetic orientations. But because categorization systems tend not to care about the energy of a situation, it cares about what a situation looks like. Those two things get flattened into a single thing, and a whole phenomenon is lost. And so it's not, it's lost again, not because it was censored or not, it's lost in a naming convention, and also a privileging of one way of thinking about reality, which is I don't believe that energy exists. I think that reality is just a bunch of people in different shapes going through an empty Cartesian space. And another tradition in which you talk about, the notion of energy coming up from the ground and, through your body and so forth. So notation systems by their definition lose much more than they capture at any given moment.
Hmm. And I guess this goes into, that many assume technology is neutral. What does your research reveal about how technologies can actively include or exclude certain identities?
Oh, it's just one, how much time do we have? So when I teach my course at Stanford on Introduction to Science, Technology, Society, there are three examples that I bring up in one of the lectures. One is this is more recent, but it was Nikon, the company Nikon, that had, in one generation of its cameras, introduced this new feature called blink detection. And this is, for anyone that's ever taken a family photo at Disneyland and, everyone is trying to get in posture and then you get home, you develop the film and little Billy was blinking and now you can't hang up the picture. And so the idea was to solve this problem, right? Well, there was a blogger, a YouTuber who of Asian descent who like documented that every single time she took a photograph, the blink detection warning light came on because it was trained effectively on the physiology of like Caucasian white male sort of physical structures and so forth. And so every single time the algorithm was going haywire. Another example, which is actually has the possibility of if up to and including physical harm and fatality, is well documented differences in like blood oxygen level, like the at home oximeter measurements, which are always important, but during COVID were super important because if the level is a certain way, you got to go to the hospital.
Mhm.
But because they were basically the algorithms were trained on light skinned individuals, they would regularly get misreadings to anyone at home of African American descent. There was a huge discrepancy on this sort of Amazon.com purchase for a blood oximeter level. And what I try to talk with my students about is, Nikon is a Japanese company. And somehow a Japanese company produced an algorithm that was sort of systemically flagging in a sort of kind of algorithmically racist way. There is no way that there was some evil genius, some Montgomery Burns at Nikon saying, I really want to lose market share and I want there to be a scandal tomorrow. And yet it made its way, somewhere and somehow through these distributed means, things find their ways. In addition to all of I think evil exists. In addition to all of that, which goes on, there is this whole other story of micro distributed decisions that lead to these kinds of outcomes. And there are just, I would venture to say that it approaches infinity, the number of examples of this.
Exactly. Not necessarily that was done intentionally, but this was one of the outcomes not foreseen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you've done extensive work on Chinese language technologies. How does your research on Chinese script help us understand, I guess, the broader global information systems?
Yeah. Thank you. So, talk about talk about exclusion. So if we, right now, China is one of the IT, juggernauts of the world, and it's the Chinese language is one of the most successful languages of the digital age. If you back up the tape night to not that long ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, all the way back to the dawn of computing, and then even before that, to typewriting and telegraphy. The prevailing understanding was that if China is going to join the industrial modern age, and at that point it was unquestionably that modern meant Western, as patterned after, say, Western Europe and the United States, that the price of entry would be severing all ties with its history and culture as represented by Chinese writing. That was the price. That was the price of entry to get on this boat. And structurally, there was truth to that because structurally, the information age, from basically Morse code and electrical telegraphy all the way through typewriting and so forth, was built by and for speakers of English. It wasn't, again, Morse did not sit down, in a dark shaded room and say, I look forward to excluding German people and I look forward to. It was, we reproduce what's close at hand, and then because then it rode on the back of colonial warships and imperial warships and American capitalism and started to spread through the world. But it was always very local at the outset. But then this very, very local technology got sort of stretched around the globe to, for some writing systems and languages, no big deal. French, fine, we have to add some accents and it'll work. Russian, different writing system, but the Russian Cyrillic behaves in certain ways similar to English and Latin. And then things get trickier. Hebrew is right to left, Arabic is right to left, and the letters connect. And then you have Chinese, which was just kind of beyond the pale. It's non-alphabetic. It's a large character set. It's not that it was intrinsically or in any essentialist way a problem, but now in relation to this information order, it was sort of incompatible. It was the idea. And so most people, including many very, very, very prominent Chinese activists and reformers and politicians, also, bought into this. I followed this sort of ragtag international group of engineers and linguists and entrepreneurs who said, you know what, I don't accept that. Like, there's no way that this is the end of the story. We want the industrial age, we want the digital age, but we don't accept these terms of service. And they banged their head around it. They banged their head against it. It's like failure, 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 meteoric success. And to me, what it shows is at any given moment, no matter how universal any given order seems, we haven't, humanity is a vast, however many 1,000-room mansion, and we're basically over here in still puttering around in like one tiny wing of it. And, where we haven't figured it out yet. We really haven't figured out humanity yet. That's my feeling.
Yeah, we're working on it. So
We're working on it.
but would you be able to share a moment where bureaucracy in the form, either forms, records, or official systems, made someone kind of quote unquote disappear in a meaningful way?
Bureaucracy does it on a regular basis. So, yeah, I mean, we now we live in an era where everything that we do is documented, and there's, it freaks us out, of course, but we are also unbelievably kind of okay with it compared to human beings. 200 years ago, before, like, people would look at us now and say, I can't fathom how you tolerate this. But that story really begins, it has deeper roots, but it really, really, really takes off in like the 17 and 1800s, when a mixture of unprecedented scale of warfare and whether it's, wars in Western Europe, and you have the sort of Taiping Rebellion and its aftermath. You have the American Civil War. People just sometimes lose sight of the fact that, like, the American federal government before and after the American Civil War is like night and day. It's just, and worldwide, like the number of men under arms, the size of the bureaucracy, the size of the federal government in any state explodes roughly around the same time. And one of the things that states do is they're just anxious. They're anxious little machines, and they want and need taxation, and they need soldiers, and they worry about real or perceived tax evaders and criminals, and so what that leads to is an explosion in the recording and documenting of really the hopes and fears of states. So the way I talk about it in the book, and this is, I'm standing on, there's no giants in the world, but I'm standing, I'm standing on the shoulders of standing on the shoulders of standing on the shoulders of so many. But, this is the birth of the passport, and this is the beginning of the modern immigration regime that we still live in. It's the So, if you get married, if you buy a house, if you cross a border, if you commit a crime, if you're perceived to commit a crime, or you're categorized as one that the state believes has a propensity to commit a crime, then that produces ink on paper and photographs and things. If you daydream about your kid, and what they're going to look like when they grow up, or will they ever get married or have kids of their own, if you just do the things that human beings do, that stuff is completely irrelevant to the state and now modern corporations in some sense. That there's just a far less likely to leave a trace of those aspects of human experience. And so there are, it's staggering. So I mean, one tiny point. So if you are an historian of marginalized economic classes, if you're an historian of women, if you're a historian of marginalized groups, the one place that historians by definition kind of have to go looking, like let's say, and if I'm a modern China historian and I want to study the history of laborers or sex workers in Shanghai, I will have to go into the law. I will have to hope that one of them got arrested and have a transcript of a conversation, because otherwise their value as human beings, their humanity doesn't register for society in many cases, but certainly not the state. So you kind of have to, the only way to see them is if they trip the wire of various recording technologies, so to speak. They run a red light, so to speak, in the game of life. And so it's just it's a constant disappearance act that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, many family historians can really relate because, again, they can find an ancestor, 20 years apart, but they cannot find continuing information about that particular ancestor. So, and I guess my next question is in regards to historians who often work with what is, of course, recorded. How do you approach what's missing, erased, or, again, never documented?
Yes. So I would say that there's an absolute long-standing privileging of the written word and the idea of the authority of the written word, and which has huge historical and cultural connotations. You think of classic books, history and the Europe and the people without history. That is the notion that any societies or cultures that do not venerate the written word, or choose that as the medium of documentation, in some sense are understood as not having history. And the steady sort of lowering of status of oral traditions and so forth as unreliable, or et cetera, mythological. So there's just from the profession of history is already very squarely in the camp of that, and there's no way not to inherit that legacy. To kind of swim against that, I think that that's when classically historians have started, this many decades ago, to look at methodologies that come from other entirely different disciplines, whether it be ethnographic methodology or kind of participant observation, oral history as a practice, even what sometimes falls into the idea of almost experimental archaeology, where you you try to sort of almost insinuate your brain, your mind into something from the past that you're trying to understand, but you have no reflections by the person who did it. You have there's no third party, but they were a weaver. They made books, they made paper, they made baskets, they made, so you do that. You start to, so I know many historians, I've done this myself, who will kind of do a crash course in some particular practice. And what's really key about that is, and everyone that I know understands this, it's not as if you do it and then you can say something definitive about the person, because you can't. It would be unethical to do that. But what does end up happening, and it's pretty magical, is just by engaging in the practice, that the person you're trying to think alongside, that they engaged in, new questions occur to you that just probably would not have occurred to you in any other form. You work on a basket for 3 days and your back is just killing you. And you start to think you start to ask questions about the body. You start to ask, and ultimately you hope that maybe one of those questions that bubbles up, maybe there is some pathway or another by which you might be able to get at that. And so there are some historians that are just they are the gods of this. They are their minds. Their minds. I say this with great admiration. So every now and then in the summer, our apartment is, ants are getting in to get water, and just the sort of iterative, distributive system and just the absolute relentlessness of sending out from the anthill, going in 9 different directions, 8 of the 9 always failing, but maybe one will find a drop and communicate back to we found it, that some historians, the ones I admire most, their minds work that way. And they just sort of send out their mind in 100 ways. 99 do not find water. But every time they don't find water, they never ever take it as proof that they should stop, that water doesn't exist. They just say, I haven't checked the right crack in the right windowsill yet. Yeah, those are the historians I admire most.
No, no, thank you so much for that. And of course, we're going to go present. So in today's digital age, social media, AI, big data, are we seeing new forms of disappearance or just updated versions of the old patterns?
Yeah, great question. I think, I think, I don't know if it is the same, but as something that has happened before, but I do think that it may happen fast enough, and that's the speed of everything that's going on is something to behold, because it may it may possibly happen fast enough that we might witness, in my view, something like what historians would refer to as an epistemic rupture or an epistemic shift. So, for any listeners new to that term, you can think of, think of college, think of university. So there's chemistry and there's philosophy and there's, all these majors and departments. Then there is, then there is the foundation of the floor that all those buildings live on. And then there is the tectonic plate that all of that is sitting on. That's an episteme, and so the dominant global episteme is, probably a half millennium old or thereabouts. And so epistemes, they change just like continents drift and crack and so forth, but they drift so slowly that pretty much no one in their lifetime ever wakes up one day and says oh, honey, look out the window. It's a different episteme. But there are elements of what's happening right now that it may just happen fast enough where we might actually have that feeling. And I'll give you one creepy example and then one sort of interesting but maybe creepy example. So think about the genre of the movie or of the book or of a song, right? So a song and a book and a movie, the one thing that they have in common is that they're made and they exist, and when we encounter them, we are watching a movie. We all will have a million different interpretations of the movie, but the movie, frame by frame, is the movie. The Godfather is the Godfather from frame 1 to frame whatever 5 million, and I don't know. God Only Knows by the Beach Boys, from note 1 to note whatever is one stable thing. And then there is art, and then there's art criticism and so forth. Well, there are people at work right now, and it's kind of here where you could log into Netflix and I could log into Netflix, and you could say, I want to watch The Godfather from Fredo's perspective. And it'll go beep, boop, 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 and it will give you The Godfather from Fredo's perspectives. You're following him around the whole story. And I might log in and say, I want one where, the Godfather isn't shot in that famous scene. And it can, and it is conceivable that not just a new set of movies will be made, but that this once absolutely unspoken, taken for granted. I mean, who would ever define that a movie is a thing that exists? Might change in our lifetime, where there could be, a grandchild who can't fathom what it meant to watch one movie. And that is a form of it, and the disappearance there is hard to even tally or calculate, because think about all of the things that we unknowingly stack on top of that unspoken assumption of what a song is, what a book is, what a film is. There's like a whole house of cards based upon that. Well, when epistemes shift, houses of cards, collapse. And so there is something that I do think that it's the mixture of the speed, but it's also the seemingly voracious appetite that like AI companies and researchers have to AI everything around us. Maybe electrification, if someone had lived through the full span of really knowing what it was like before the installation of electric light, and then kind of living a good portion of life in that, maybe that's a counterpart, but I'm not even sure that comes close to what we're seem to be witnessing, unfolding. So yeah, I do think that it may be of such magnitude that maybe a new form of disappearance is coming into being. But then again, I've never lived through an epistemic shift before, so I can't understand. We theoretically, one side of an epistemic shift and the other side of an epistemic rupture no longer speak each other's languages. So I don't know if we'll even be able to put it into words.
Mhm. And I guess on the other side of that is, are there ways that individuals or communities can resist this disappearance, or at least reclaim visibility with these systems?
I think so. I do think in the grand scheme of things, no, because we're still talking about the second law of thermodynamics. We're still talking about, heat death, taking any spirituality out of the picture for a second and just talking about, in given enough time, the earth swallows the sun, that sort of thing. But then let's take the clock further. But in terms of the scale that matters to us, yes. And I really think a little bit goes a very, very, very long way. So what might a little bit be? So right now in my family, and I credit my wife with this, like she's much better than I am at this, is we'll get to the end of a school year and, I don't know if she uses like a file folder, but basically think of a file folder and it's just like 2026, boom. There's no order to the inside the file folder, and there's no labeling of every sheet of paper inside the file folder. And of course, like I talk about in the book, that stuff can become jostled loose of the file folder, but it vastly increases the chance, like enormously increases the chance that in 40 years, we'll be able to not just have those drawings that our kids made, but have those drawings and have some touch point of time to know that this picture came after that picture came before this one, and these happened around the same time. From an historian standpoint, that's the coin of the realm. It's less about like absolute times on a calendar than before and after, and more or less synchronous. That's where the work of figuring out what something may have looked like really comes from. And so it doesn't need to be anxious and documenting everything and scanning everything and so forth. It's little actions. Take one family photograph, take it to Kinko's, make a color copy of it, and then just magic circle everyone's head and with a magic marker and be like, Thomas Sean Mullaney, Thomas Charles Mullaney, dad, son, and then just fold it up, tuck it in the photo album. And then in 50 years, human beings are little pattern recognition machines. Like, oh, that's the same person as that person, and looks like a younger version of that guy, and we can piece it together. But just that one sheet of paper is missing. It might as well be a random box in a thrift store somewhere, for all that I know who anyone in the photograph is. So I do think there are little ways that we can keep things aloft, or a bit longer, in ways that matter to us, that we'll really be able to feel. Yeah.
Definitely, just definitely with the mattering part. And as we come to a close, Professor Mullaney, after reading your book, what's one thing you hope people will start noticing differently in their everyday interactions with information systems?
Yeah, and let me say thank you again for being interested in the book and for inviting me on. What I hope, and I think if anyone reads the book, they'll see this, is it sounds like a very heavy book. It's of disappearance and parents passing and so forth, but I do hope that if and when people want to read the book, they'll see that there is a kind of optimism, or almost, I really am in awe now that anything holds together at all. Like it's not just that the story, and that this is a well documented, no, not understood, the well documented story and admiration of, like, the absolute improbability of the existence of life itself in a universe that is just really, really allergic to order of most sorts, but also just that in our day-to-day life, more often than not, if I have a 10 o'clock coffee with someone, I make it, and they make it, and the coffee guy makes it, and, like, this fictional thing called dollars and cents make it. And I speak a language because someone sang the alphabet song to me like 9 billion times. And just, like, the number one thing is, whenever you're there on a on a Monday at 9 a.m., and then at 9:01 a.m., you're still you, and the world around you is pretty much the same at 9 o'clock as it is at 9:01. That's a miracle. That is, like, and it's a phenomenal, almost incalculable amount of work done at almost every register, the atomic, the molecular, let alone, like, the level of organisms and so forth, to make 9 o'clock and 9:01 be continuous, because there's nothing natural about continuity. Continuity is the thing that's weird. Discontinuity is the rule. Continuity is special. And so, one is, if you forget things, if things get lost in family history or history, like, give yourself a break. Reader, give ourselves a break. It's hard enough to get through Monday. It's hard enough to get through Tuesday, let
Exactly.
alone to reconstruct Monday from, 50 years ago. But do know that getting through Monday and remembering Monday from 10 years ago are actually at odds with each other. They are, it's like realizing, it's like one of those things where you realize that, wow, the thing I need to do for my job, which is sit at my desk all day, is really bad for my health. So I'm going to have to make a choice to, like, do something that is not so good for work in order to, like, continue living and functioning. It's a similar thing with life, keeping life information and then keeping history information. They do not go together. And so, you do, but a little bit goes a long way. A dash of salt goes a long way. And yeah.
Yeah, those are some home truths that we all need to take.
Yeah.
But it is definitely true. I mean, if you're trying to recreate something from 10, as you said, 50, 100 years ago, that's going to be quite challenging to do, and not to take yourself so seriously about it, and relook back at it another time. But
Yeah.
no, thank you. I really appreciate you coming on and having the time and speaking about your book, because again, it gives another perspective of how we need to kind of look at things and how we need to approach things as well when we are in this whole thing of keeping or being the keeper of information. So no,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you so much. I
Yeah.
really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.